Wanted to have a panel to really begin to talk about both communication and research needs, and begin to have some discussion and development of tangible steps as we move forward. And that's really the point of the panel. I've asked each one of them to just speak very briefly, 5, 6, 7 minutes. And then I want to ensure that we have time at the end to have some dialogue in the room around that also as we begin to develop these. Again, this is meant to be collaborative. You've met every person on this panel or heard from them except for Dr. Hoelzer, who's with the Pew Institute, and she's been with us. She was with us all day yesterday, and so she's been hearing these conversations, and so certainly a part of this, and just wanted to recognize her, introduce her, because you've not seen her up here previously during the last couple of days. And so we'll just go down the table, and Dr. Moore, I'll start with you, and we'll work our way down. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Nevil. Well, first of all, thank you. Thank you, everyone, for your participation. This has been a great symposium so far. I'm going to leave my comments pretty brief and focus them mainly on communication. As we move forward, communication has to be clear and concise. You've heard the complexity of the issue that we've had in the last, 48 hours or so. One thing that we really are challenged with is a consistent message. If we think about something simple as antibiotics in our food, we know that we have a lot of statements out there, a lot of marketing that goes on, antibiotic-free, antibiotic-free food, and there's concern by the consumer regarding the presence of antibiotics in their meat. And I think one communication point that I'll bring up is that when we talk about maximum residue limits in food and how that can be misconstrued by the public, and we can actually harm ourselves by not communicating that fully. It's a double-edged sword in that it's tough to communicate that to the public, to the consumer, in a way they can understand it, but it's also a liability if we're not fully transparent and concise in our message. So as we talk about residue, volatile residue versus tolerable residue is one issue that I think in the communication side is we need to keep in the forefront of that, and how we communicate that is going to be critical. It is tough on all these topics on how to get a clear and concise message that's consistent across all stakeholders. So I think that's my key for the going forward, is how we develop that and how we ensure that happens across the board.
Thank you. Good morning. I guess just a couple comments on the communication point. I think, as has been discussed at this symposium, I think last year, certainly, and there's a need for greater clarity around, the message that we're sending in terms of what the intended goal is, in terms of the efforts that we're working towards, in terms of what is the outcome that we're trying to attain, across the various veterinary sectors. So there's been a lot of sort of concern about focusing those goals simply on a goal of reduction or elimination of use. But if that is not the message, then what is the alternative message that we want to be conveying? And if it's, optimizing antibiotic use through good stewardship, I think it's critical that we then have, some consensus around what does that actually mean, and have a clear, concise message on what stewardship means across veterinary settings, and be able to show through data and science that progress is being made towards accomplishing those desired outcomes. Certainly, there's been a lot of discussion around market factors, and and certainly the market is driving change as well. But issues like setting standards around raising animals without antibiotics, while that may be a reasonable option for consumers in certain settings, I think it has the challenge of sort of setting expectations for consumers and sort of suggesting that that may in fact be the goal. In other words, to get to a place where we're raising animals without antibiotics. And I think that has created a challenge for us in terms of messaging and, to consumers in terms of what the intended outcome or goal is of all these efforts. And then on the research front, I would just say I think one point that we need to continue to focus on is on what are the drivers.
Should we fix that for you?
Yes.
There you go.
Thank you. What are the drivers of antibiotic use in various veterinary settings? I think we're asking producers, ranchers, farmers to use antibiotics more judiciously, but they in fact have some real and significant animal health issues to deal with. So they need to have alternatives in terms of how do they effectively address those issues. So I think if we, research focused on those issues, how can we use and the antibiotics we have to address those issues more effectively, or are there other strategies that producers or farmers or ranchers can use to manage those conditions? Because I think, getting to the root cause will help to reduce some of the pressure that they feel to have to reach for those antibiotics because they have actually, real animal health issues to deal with. Thank you.
Thank you. And I put together a few slides just for the more visual people in the audience like myself. And I'll switch gears a little bit and talk about what we at Pew see as the key research needs to move this gigantic issue of antibiotic resistance forward. I'm really excited to be here and have the opportunity to do that. Fantastic. So we heard a lot over the last 3 days about research needs, data gaps, about a lot of issues with trying to move this issue forward. But my mind is pretty simple. So when I was trying to think through what it all comes down to, for me it comes down to 3 key questions. First, how are antibiotics used in animal agriculture? Then how should antibiotics be used? And finally, what can we do to reduce the need to use antibiotics? Now the first question, how are antibiotics used? We heard a lot over the last 2 days about how challenging it is to figure out how to measure that, huge differences between the species. Chicken is very different from a cow. Turkeys, in what I understand, in a lot of respects, are actually a lot more similar to a pig than to a chicken, but they're clearly neither. So huge differences with how to measure, when to measure, how to get at the right questions. I think Nora did a fantastic job yesterday looking at how can we aggregate the data when we have it, how can we make sense of it. And as Laurie said yesterday, how can we provide that context that is so important to really understand the question. But from where we stand, unless we have some understanding of how antibiotics are currently used, unless we have some kind of baseline, it is really difficult to track progress. We heard a lot over the last 3 days about the desire to demonstrate progress, show success, but if we don't have a baseline, that's really difficult to do. We at Pew also are very big proponents of science and evidence-based policy. And if you think about things like allocation of research funding, it's really important to have that data on how antibiotics are currently used to understand where the biggest needs are, where to prioritize those research dollars. So it's a really big question, but for where we stand at Pew, how antibiotics are used is the first thing that we really need to address in order to move this issue forward. A second question is also a really big one. How should antibiotics be used? We heard a lot over the last couple of days about antibiotic stewardship programs. What does it actually mean to be good stewards of antibiotics in the animal ag space? What are core components of antibiotic stewardship? And we in particular heard this morning a lot about behavioral drivers. And I know on the human side, there's increasing focus on trying to understand what is driving prescriber behavior, understanding what pressures they're feeling, and then based on that, trying to invent more effective intervention strategies. We at Pew are actually just starting to look at what kind of information in the veterinary space exists on behavioral drivers, because we do think that that is a really important part of the puzzle. And then we heard a lot over the last couple of days about demonstrating good stewardship. We think it's really important, but there are lots of questions about how to do that. How can we actually demonstrate that we're using antibiotics effectively? We also learned a lot about antibiotic use practices, clearly very important to the question of how antibiotics should be used, but a lot of question and research needs still. We heard about antibiotic use decision-making. Nora, I think, again, did a really fantastic job yesterday walking through her decisions when she's on the farm, thinking about which antibiotic to choose, whether to choose an antibiotic, but trying to get a better understanding of how that decision process is actually working, what kind of information is necessary, how good and robust is that information. We heard a lot about that yesterday, too. And then trying to understand other ways that we can help, that we can make that process easier and support it. We heard a lot about optimizing treatment efficacy and minimizing unintended consequences, whether that's drug residues or whether that's minimizing the risk of selection. I think we had two really fantastic presentations yesterday that talked about what is that right dose. And I think there are more questions than answers, at least that's what I took from these presentations. But is it possible to find that right dose that maximizes efficacy and minimizes the risk that we're selecting for resistant bacteria? I think there are lots of opportunities there. And then we've heard a lot about continuous improvement. We heard a lot about the need for reviewing treatment outcomes, evaluating how effective they are, documenting treatment failures, and trying to understand why those treatments have failed, and then trying to learn and become better stewards of antibiotics. Also, what are the opportunities for innovation and for continuous improvement? And we heard a lot about the need for meaningful surveillance. If we don't have a good understanding of antibiotic resistance pressures, then it's very difficult to make progress. But as we heard, there are lots of questions about which bacteria to select. I think Salmonella, Campylobacter are pretty clear, but once you go into animal pathogens, what should we be looking for? What kind of samples? Where to sample? How meaningful are samples from necropsies, etc.? So how should antibiotics be used is a really big question, but it's really central to moving the debate forward. And then the third question is, how do we reduce the need for antibiotics? We learned a lot about the need for management practices. We heard this morning about sharing best practices. And we at Pew, hopefully in the next couple of weeks, will have requests for proposals coming out to start to do some of that and collect at least some of the information that's out in the published literature. But obviously, alternative products such as vaccines or probiotics are also really important, and trying to understand how we can use them better to minimize the need for antibiotics. And then there are other strategies, such as disease-resistant breeds, etc., that we can look at. But really trying to better understand how can we reduce the need for antibiotics. And with this, I would love to continue the conversation. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Karin. And I made most of my comments yesterday, so I'm going to make up for taking too much time yesterday by not taking up much this morning. I think it's important that we work together to get the data that we've all talked about is so important to making these decisions. And we were fortunate to get some funding in USDA APHIS Veterinary Services this year to start with the data collection process. One of the challenges that we've had is producer participation in answering those questionnaires that are essential to the survey. And we'll continue to have those challenges. We've always had those kinds of challenges whenever we conduct these surveys. I think that over the last couple of days I've heard maybe a little bit different concern with the amount of work that's been going on in the private sector on the corporate front, if you will, taking a look at this issue, and I wonder if we might need to take a different look at our data collection process and look at where the decisions are being made now. We've always asked the question about the veterinary client-patient relationship, but clearly with the implementation of 209 and 213, the decision on whether antibiotics are administered to animals or not and in what fashion, for what reason, are being made by veterinarians. And the veterinary profession has to embrace that responsibility, and part of that may be to be able to report that use. And filling out the VFD captures some of the information, but as I mentioned yesterday, that metadata that goes along with the reasons why those VFDs were issued may need to be expanded and may be the best source of information for us to gather around use in animals. Those are just thoughts off the top of my head from listening to the conversation the last couple of days, recognizing that we all get caught in paradigms, and one of those that we've been caught in all along, I think, is that we had to go to the producer to get that information because before 209 and 213 were implemented, the veterinarian wasn't always part of that decision-making process. And so to really know what was being administered on the farm, you had to go to that level. The other part of it has to do with the microbiome. And there's a fascinating talk that if you have time or interest and want to listen to it, that's given by Bonnie Bassler, and it's on TED Talks. You can query BASLER and bacteria, and it'll come up, and you can look at it. A lot of what Dr. Kahn said this morning is echoed, or she says there in that talk. Certainly, I think that bacteria are a part of our physiology. The Human Microbiome Project showed that. The same thing happens in animals when we administer antibiotics. There's an effect not just against the pathogen, but all the bacteria that are on our skin and in our bodies, in our enteric tract. And the antibiotic chemicals that we use are derived from bacteria, as David White said the other day, and those are a signaling mechanism between bacteria that turn capabilities on and off that are only manifest when there are enough bacteria communicating with each other sometime to be able to do that. So it's not the single bacteria itself that we need to be concerned with as much as maybe the populations of bacteria that make our bodies and make our ecosystems healthy. And I would encourage you to go and take a look at that. It's entertaining at the very least, and it certainly is educational. Other than that, I'm just going to pass it on and wait for questions.
What was the name again?
Bonnie Bassler. Bonnie Bassler's TED Talk. It's BASLER.
So I'm going to keep this pretty brief too. We've talked a lot about total use is a combination of necessary and unnecessary use. And one of the communication things I'd like to highlight, or one of the things I'd like to bring up, is the unnecessary use is an easy place to focus. It's where, we're not sacrificing animal welfare for anything. If we could just get rid of that unnecessary use. But I think we need to be careful how we define that and when we define that. So it's really easy for me to look retrospectively at what I've done with the information I have now. Hindsight is 20/20. I can go back and say, hey, maybe I didn't really need that there. But when we're making the decision at the time, that can be a little bit more difficult. And so if we're defining unnecessary use retrospectively, I think we need to be careful that we're not putting veterinarians in a position where at the time they need to make the decision, they don't actually have all that information. And the other thing that plays into that is a lot of times we're asking them to apply population level medicine at an individual level. And that can be complicated too. Information about, only 1 in 6 of these is going to benefit from an antimicrobial. That's all fine and good at a population level. But if I'm standing next to the chute and I think that is my diagnosis, unless I know which 1 out of 6 that is, that's not as useful. I'm likely to use it anyway. So just realize that those challenges exist. I think we can make some progress as far as adding some technologies and tools to get the right diagnosis in the beginning, and then maybe adding some tools and technologies to decide or to delay treatment and be able to treat them later. But it is challenging, and sometimes it's pretty easy to look backwards and see what we should have done, but it's harder to make that decision at the time. And then as far as kind of in response to Miles's question about research needs, I think, there's a lot of ways to measure use, and quite honestly, especially in feedlot settings, that data about use is there in most of those big feedlot systems and relatively accessible. So I think there is room to make some progress about drug choice and how that choice is driving resistance. It's just going to take us a little bit of time to get it done.
Well, we obviously need innovation and research into substitutes for antibiotics. If we're going to reduce the need for antibiotics, we're going to need new vaccines, probiotics, other compounds that can reduce the need for medically important antibiotics in animals. These products need to be attractive for producers to use. They need to work, they need to be easy to use, and they need to support the producer's economic interests. And then on the other side of the economic interest, we need to understand the consumer. The consumer is already used to hearing antibiotic-free and raised without antibiotics. But if we all agree we're not going to be able to raise livestock with zero use of antibiotics, then we need to help the consumers understand stewardship versus no antibiotics ever.
Well, there's been a lot said about stewardship, and I fully support stewardship programs to reduce the need for antimicrobials in animals, and that would be in all animals. And as part of that, we have to look at some of the basic animal husbandry skills that we were taught as students. And we first need to use the information that we've had around for a long time, because there are ways that we can reduce morbidity. Morbidity drives mortality, and obviously morbidity drives antimicrobial usage. And it's one of our goals on the human and veterinary side is to reduce antimicrobial usage and still address satisfactorily the animal welfare issues and the production issues. So to me, reducing bovine respiratory disease prevalence is an opportunity to offer us advantages on three fronts. One of those, if we have fewer animals that are sick, obviously the fewer antimicrobials that we're going to use. Secondly, it decreases mortality and it decreases the number of chronics that develop. That addresses some of our welfare issues. And then also there's the performance side. We work on the beef cattle side at the stocker and feedlot level as a margin business, and the margins are actually quite low and they're variable. Sometimes we make quite a bit of money, and then the one that gave us that money comes and takes us back in the next cycle. And so the cost itself of the disease and the things that we use to treat disease are very significant. Things that we measure in our treatment programs for respiratory disease include such things as retreatment risk. If we can get an animal well with the first treatment with an antimicrobial, there are great welfare advantages as well as economic advantages and production advantages for us. An example comes from Iowa State University, where nearly 60,000 animals are in a data set from feedlots. If they were treated one time, there's virtually no death loss. If they were treated one time, 4.2% of those animals treated died. That's a reasonable case fatality rate in the feedlot industry. But if treated 2 or more times, instead of a 4.2% case fatality rate, it's now 15.6%. Looking at the gain side, as you would expect, those that were never sick gained better than those treated one time, but that difference was not great. But the difference between the animals treated 2 or more times and the gain in those that were never treated was very substantial. So the time that it took to get them to market was decreased if we can retain the health. They also looked at the economics, and there was a very significant difference in profit in those three categories. Those, again, animals never treated, those treated one time, and those treated 2 or more times. The second measure, then, we've already alluded to, is case fatality rate. So even when we look at that on averages, and unfortunately, that's the way that we deal with livestock production, is on averages. So within a pen or within a barn full of hogs that are in the finishing stage, we have animals in there that are greatly outgaining others. That variance is probably greater in the beef industry than it is, Joe, over in the swine industry, because we have such a wide genetic base, and these animals come from so many different parts of the country. But nevertheless, within that pen, there are animals that you just can't hardly make them sick, and those that are on the weak side, about anything will make them sick, and those that respond well to treatment and those don't. So that gets us back to some of the information that genomics is going to bring to us, and I'm very excited about what we're learning on these various heritability projects that are undergoing study at the current time. And there's animals in those pens that are converting feed very efficiently and those that are less efficient. I'll give you one quick example. In Oklahoma many years ago, they initiated the Oklahoma Steer Feed Out program, where farmers and ranchers sent a few animals in, they put them all in one pen, and then they compared their gain and their health and so forth, and also compared the carcass traits. One rancher's animals gained 1.5 pounds per day. There are other ranchers whose calves gained 4.5 pounds per day. So the one who had calves that gained 1.5 pounds per day said, this has to be wrong, so he sent calves in the next year. They also gained 1.5 pounds per day, so he sold his cows and started over again. But I think that's true also on the health side, and there's some data to support that. In addition, there is the cull to dead ratio. And in the feedlot industry, we call the animals that we cull for either injury or non-response to treatment or just poor performance, we call those railers. And that's costly. We'll have about one of those animals in that category to every 4 to 6 deaths that we have. In higher risk cattle, that ratio will narrow. Sometimes there's one animal marketed early for every maybe 2 animals that die. And so those are important to us. And then there's the economic side as well. So how do we get to where we want to go, where we can more accurately use antimicrobials and reduce the use of antimicrobials? It's been cited several times that physicians are greatly over-prescribing antibiotics. So they've been able to quantify that. My question is, how many animals do we treat in the cattle industry and perhaps in other livestock groups that don't need an antimicrobial? We don't know that answer, but I'm sure that we're not any better than the physicians are in our prescribing accuracy. One of the problems we have on the cattle side is our ability to accurately determine which animals in a pen or out in the pasture are in need of treatment, or at least bringing them to our hospital system and making that determination of whether or not to treat the animals. So I know that our pen riders work hard. We check most of our cattle on horseback. And a pen rider is assigned 4,000 or 5,000 cattle when they have moderate risk groups in the feed yard. If we handle a lot of really high risk cattle, we may lower that to one pen rider to 3,000 or 4,000. In low risk cattle, one pen rider has the adequate time to check 10,000 cattle every day. But think of the number of decisions this person makes on horseback or riding through that pen and then going to the next pen. So our sensitivity and specificity is estimated to be 60%. That may be generous. So are there opportunities out there for us to do a better job, a more accurate job of finding the animals which need to come to the hospital system and be examined? There are some systems that are being studied right now, remote detection devices where with specialized tags and going to the satellite or a receiver, and then that information has gone through some algorithms and comes back and says, you need to pull calf number 461 out of pen 212. We don't think it's doing well. Some of the research done by some researchers at Kansas State shows that the computerized detection system can find a sick animal 18 hours sooner than a cowboy or cowgirl on horseback. That offers great advantages for therapeutic success, reduces the prevalence or the incidence of retreatment risk. And so there's others out there that are studying that same type of a system where they're treating fewer animals but accomplishing a higher response rate. In other words, a higher percentage of animals are responding to the first round of treatments. It also lowers treatment cost. For those animals we bring to chute side, we know that not all of those are sick, but our standby tool has been the thermometer. And there's a lot of variation in rectal temperature among cattle, but it is a tool that gives us some sort of a measurement that the person who is treating animals can use. But we also have in our systems there, as part of our stewardship program, what we call an observed treatment. The animal that looks pretty good when it gets to the chute and the rectal temperature is normal, and it doesn't show the typical signs or clinical symptoms that we would see in the sick animal. So if Dr. Flynn's people ever come out and inspect us and they ask, what is caspermycin? Casper was a ghost. It's a ghost drug. So we assign a caspermycin treatment to this animal, which says they didn't get an antibiotic. And incidentally, in that program, our retreatment or our repull rate in those cattle is very similar to what we have when we give an antibiotic. So about 20% of those or 25% of those will come back to us, and then it will be eventually treated. But in one case the other day, 36 animals at a feed yard were assigned to that treatment. They did what we asked them to do, did not administer an antibiotic, and the next day they sent 29 of those back to their home pen. 6 of those were treated. So to me, that's an approach to stewardship. But the technology that we use to decide whether an animal is sick or not sick can stand improvement. We have now some promising data on use of the ultrasound. We know that the old standard stethoscope has a very low sensitivity based upon a report coming out of Montreal. Sensitivity was about 6%. But now we have a a stethoscope which is linked into a computer, goes through some algorithms that helps us to assign a lung score, which may help us to be more accurate in our diagnosis, and then therefore a more judicious application of antibiotics to treat the disease. And then finally, we need more tools in the beef industry to prevent disease. coming from the vaccine side and of course some non-vaccine and non-antimicrobial products. On the virus side, for example, we have vaccines that I think are good in helping us to at least greatly reduce the incidence of BRD or to prevent it. That would be our bovine herpes virus, bovine viral diarrhea virus, bovine respiratory syncytial virus, and our para-influenza virus vaccines. But in our surveillance studies, we're seeing a high prevalence of coronavirus. In a study that was just published a couple of weeks ago, close to 44% of the animals that were considered healthy were shedding the coronavirus. 8% were shedding influenza D. Are those pathogens in the animal, or are they just inhabitants that just like living there? We don't know that. On the bacterial side, we have Mannheimia vaccines, we have Pasteurella, we have Staphylococcus, we have Mycoplasma, but the clinical efficacy of those vaccines are lacking. So we don't need more of the same, but we need more. We need new technology vaccines to help us to reduce the incidence. And finally, along the other thought process of using some non-antimicrobials to reduce the incidence of disease, therefore the use of antimicrobials, there are some immunomodulators out now approved for using, one in beef cattle and one in dairy cattle. And the one approved in beef cattle is intended to improve the function of the innate immune system. And in a large study published last year, it reduced death loss by 22 to 24% in a study that was replicated 15 times. The other immunomodulator that's intended for use in dairy cows reduces mastitis by 28% in the first 30 days on feed. So that's kind of a summary of the things that we need. I don't know that we necessarily need the stronger and greater antibiotic, although if you bring that to market and it's approved for beef cattle, we'll use it. But we need to work on these other technologies and other management systems to reduce the need for treating the animals.
Excellent. We have plenty of time for questions here, and that's really what this is designed to do, is to facilitate some conversation. I do have a question just to get us started off with. I think clearly there's some communication gaps that we have relative to producers. I'm wondering, and we're in early days, but anecdotally, what are you seeing? Response to VFD, is it helping at least communicate the importance of antibiotics in herd health and those kinds of things? Anybody have a response to that? Nobody wants to take that one on yet.
I can try. I'm not sure I understand your question, but is
VFD, is it becoming a tool to at least facilitate conversation and increase awareness among producers around antibiotics, stewardship, and ultimately herd health? And that's a favorable unintended consequence, but...
Sure. So I'll start and somebody else can go a different direction if they want. I think that there's sort of two groups of people. There's the group of people that was originally using a veterinarian anyway. They may not have been using the veterinarian for their feed grade antimicrobial, but they certainly had that relationship. And for them, I don't know that it changed much other than they're now receiving that piece of paper. I think there's also a group of people that didn't use a veterinarian and were deciding on their own or with their nutritionist what they were going to put in their feed. And for that group, for some of them, it has created a relationship and they've engaged, and for some of them, it has just made them hate veterinarians more because they're, the thing standing between what they used to be able to do.
Yeah.
Neville, we've had some pretty active campaigns. I touched on those yesterday on educating producers about issues like injection site lesions, and I think we've had some pretty effective campaigns on cattle handling and changing the way that we manage our cattle. But I don't know that we've had a really concentrated effort to educate people about antimicrobial resistance and our stewardship programs. The beef cattle industry has a stewardship program. We have some good literature, but perhaps we should review what's been successful in the past in educating our producers and take this issue to them through extension, through the veterinarians and nutritionists that work with these producers. And also, there are, as was mentioned, there are a lot of people who don't go to meetings, the traditional meetings, and they don't necessarily read the trade magazines. But one of the things that we found effective years ago when we were talking about the beef quality assurance program, was to go to the auction markets, and the auction markets would send out flyers. And so we have to be thinking about how do we touch the masses out there that are not easily contacted. There's a lot of those out there. And there's a lot of our producers that really could care less of what comes across the internet every day because they don't use it. I mean, more and more people are connected, but there's certainly a lot of people who are not. So I think there are some ways that we can improve our educational efforts.
And so I'll follow up on Nora's comments. I think that the VFD did create a groundswell of discussion. Anecdotally, talking to veterinarians across the country, there were quite a few veterinarians that when their producer came to them and said, I need a VFD, they were a little bit in shock because they had prescribed something years ago and that practice was still in place and they weren't necessarily had direct veterinary oversight of that issue. So in that regard, the VFD was a very powerful tool to increase that conversation regarding antibiotic use. And as we push that back under the oversight of the veterinarian and creating that veterinary client-patient relationship, which is critical to addressing the issue and educational process, as Bob mentioned, in really moving the message of antimicrobial resistance out to the general public. To elicit some more conversation, Neville, I was thinking about the antimicrobial resistance issue, stewardship issue, and if we look at it from a very business type of standpoint, if we looked at our balance sheet on the topic of antimicrobial resistance, our balance sheet may not look that good. You know, we have probably more liabilities out there right now than we have assets that are going on. But if we look at our cash flow, income statement, and the things we have happening in the industries across all stakeholders, we have a very positive income statement if you use that as an analogy to what's happening in the space of antimicrobial resistance. So we just need to keep that going forward. The big challenge being how do we find those key performance indicators that show we're moving the ball, changing the issue. And so I think that's what I'd challenge the group here today to come up with those key performance indicators, those types of items that show progress and that we can measure, given the complexity of the issue.
To Tony Forshee, State Veterinarian in Ohio and current chair of NIAA. Follow a little bit up on Dr. Smith's comments about the VFD and the word getting out there. Most of the calls that come into my office to me are from veterinarians and producers who don't know anything about the VFD. So we haven't done a very good job of getting that out there. The other bad thing, I think, or maybe it's just normal attrition, but I'm going to see a lot of our very small feed mills go out of business now because of the VFD, because they can't afford to inventory the product to any volume to be able to meet those VFD needs on those producers. And those producers don't want to do it. They don't want to do the VFD. So it has its more good than bad, certainly, but I think we are going to lose a lot of our small feed mills.
All right, hi. I am Donna Ritter. I'm a chicken veterinarian for a broiler company, and I got kind of a comment and then a question. So, you know, data has been presented that the impact of antibiotic use in food animals on AMR infections of humans at best occurs at pretty low levels, okay? But it's important, you know, all antibiotic use leads to resistance, so we got to do our part. I get that part. But the whole meeting has been about reducing unnecessary use of antibiotics. You know, I don't hear anyone suggesting that we delay or withhold treatment from animals sick with a bacterial disease that would likely benefit from antibiotic therapy. So I think that's good. So one idea, or I think a gap maybe, is the lack of agreed upon or published treatment protocols for common food animal diseases or decision tree to help us make the decision on the should question, right? When should we use an antibiotic? Well, kind of what I think, what you think, what somebody else thinks is where we're stuck. and then we say, well, like that production system is inappropriate use of antibiotics, and this one's too far the other way. So, are there treatment protocols available? I don't believe there are in chickens. I've been doing this 35 years. I haven't seen any. I don't know. Maybe there's some hiding out there somewhere. So I would just like the panel to comment on that.
I can get started by talking about the companion animal space. Understanding companion animals clearly are very different from food animals, but I think there might be some lessons learned there along the lines that you mentioned, where they really came together internationally, experts from pharmacology, internal medicine, etc., and they tried to tackle the most common diseases that they see in dogs and cats: respiratory disease, urinary tract disease, dermatology, and they really tried to come up with these treatment guidelines. Clearly, it was very contentious, lots of data gaps, but they were able to put some papers into the peer-reviewed literature. And what that actually did was it spurred research, because there was a lot of disagreement with the guidelines that expert group came up with. And in the end, what they were, for instance, able to show for urinary tract infections was that the original guideline was 14 days of treatment. And they showed that usually 3 or 5 days of treatment are sufficient. And they were even able to show under which conditions treatment really didn't make sense. So there's been a lot of research spurred and a lot of improvement in stewardship, a lot of knowledge generated because the group came together and put something out there that clearly wasn't perfect, but was a starting point for discussion.
I'll maybe just respond to that a little bit in that I know other members of our research group have been asked to write protocols that end up being decision trees, and to some extent we've really resisted that simply because the production systems are complicated enough and diverse enough that it's really tough to come up with the right answer. So it would be like saying, well, water is a valued resource and we want to make sure we're using it appropriately, so we're going to say that a dairy cow should only have 30 gallons of water a day, regardless of whether she lives in Florida where it's 105 or Minnesota where it's 30 degrees. And, there's a difference in need and there's a difference in disease pressure. And so I think, some field efficacy trials so that we have some idea what efficacy we're likely to get out of that drug choice can be useful, but I'm not sure that we're ready, or I'm not sure that our production systems are identical enough for us to be able to come up with okay, if you have this disease, you should use this drug. And the other complication to that is that antibiotic choice is always about a drug-bug combination. And so even if it's in the same species, there might be a serotype that responds very differently to one drug than another, and then especially if we start talking about resistance. So there are a lot of challenges to that.
Just adding a comment to that, I think Donnie mentioned that I think there's general understanding and appreciation for the fact that antibiotics are needed and make sense in the context of needing to address an animal health need, and I think there's a general appreciation for that, and so I guess to me I think part of the question is sort of how specific do you try to sort of drill down to, and I think certainly, and that's sort of clearly the challenge for us when you look at the issue, because it's cutting across such a broad swath of different settings in which antibiotics are being used, and those settings vary greatly in terms of how disease is being managed in those various settings. So I think it does touch on even at the start, as a starting point, do we have a clear message in terms of what we're conveying, even at a higher level, around best practices or good stewardship in terms of how antibiotics are being used to manage disease, whether that's for treating disease, controlling disease, or preventing disease. And I think that's at least as a starting point in my mind, is that can we again, understanding that when you start drilling down into the different production settings, there's some very specific issues to deal with. But are there some common threads that simply sort of cut across all those veterinary settings that can sort of formulate, a few core principles that can be articulated as a way of explaining more generally why antibiotics are important and what role they're playing in terms of managing disease. Because I think the challenge is once you start drilling down into the very specific situation, then obviously then, I think that's a much more complex sort of message in terms of how do you meet the needs in this particular setting or that particular setting.
Just a comment on really a case study in veterinary medicine. About 10 years ago, we saw the advent of some generic ivermectin products. Mm-hmm. Now, these are certainly not antibiotics, but the sales of the Mariel product had all but stopped. It was a tremendously underused product. And we saw the advent of a number of generic labels that were selling at roughly 20% of the cost of the name brand product. And it caused a tremendous surge in the use of those products. And the point in this is that policy at FDA and pricing by drug companies probably has a tremendous impact on the utilization of antibiotics. And I think that the feedlot managers that are faced with looking at treatment choices, and there are 3 drugs available, there is similar efficacy across those 3 drugs, certainly price figures into those decision-making trees very heavily. Fortunately, almost without exception, our drug company partners, and this is not an incrimination, I think this is a good thing, have typically had price increases far outpacing the rate of inflation, 5% a year or more. And I think that may be a good thing in terms of the industry and sort of curbing the use of what are becoming very expensive drugs. So my comment would be, I think we need to understand economics as a potential piece of the stewardship puzzle, in that if we were to have public policy change that would allow in, for example, extremely cheap raw materials from, say, China that would affect the availability of generic antibiotics on the veterinary medical side, it could have a real negative impact on the usage patterns. If we had a disruptive drug that was effectively an enterofloxacin that cost 20% of the name brand product. If you give some comments on the economic part of it.
Thanks. I don't know that I have any comment on that. I was going to comment on maybe the previous question, since nobody jumped in on the economics question, and say that information sharing does a lot to influence behavior. And when we conduct these surveys and look at how antibiotics are used on the farm, and we're able to gather information in the first place, it needs to be people need to be willing to share it. But if we're able to gather that information and then share it more broadly, these kinds of things that you're talking about, Don, in terms of protocols and use and so forth, and understanding how others are using antibiotics effectively will influence behavior in the long run. The key there is really to be able to gather the information in the first place and then report that back in a way that's useful to the individual that's making the decision. And my greatest fear as I look at what we're attempting to do is that in many cases, those sort of best practices on the farm may be ones that people want to hold close to the vest, and because they do offer maybe a competitive advantage in terms of production capacity. And we heard that yesterday. So maybe that comes back a little bit to your question on economics, and maybe not quite to the extent that you asked it in terms of the cost of the drug, but the cost of anything that increases the cost of production and generates a shorter margin and a return on that investment is going to influence how we behave and the choices we make in the production setting.
I think that also goes back to the first question about the VFD and whether that increased the conversations that were being had around the industry. Because I mean, I think that the listening sessions that FDA held and the listening sessions and educational sessions that the Farm Foundation held really gave producers and veterinarians the opportunity to all sit in the same room and have those conversations. And that's a venue by which information and best practices can be shared.
So I just wanted to go back to the comment about the protocols and decision trees, just because I know everyone is already watching California, as you should be, but we are mandated to develop stewardship guidelines and recommend best management practices. And as you probably know, California is a very large state and has very different climates within the state, very different production types, or production management styles within production classes. So we're very aware of the complexities with developing a program that may try to blanket recommend within a production class. So right now we're trying to gather the information of what's happening in California, and then we will be developing guidelines for specific species, production classes. And I would invite you to keep an eye on us, and we really do invite feedback. And when we're developing those guidelines, we will be utilizing experts not only within California, but experts in the field in those specific diseases. And we're very cognizant of not being prescriptive. And so anyway, I just would like to invite you to keep an eye on that program. Hopefully it'll be useful and not too prescriptive, but potentially help develop a thought process for specific diseases.
Son. I'm kind of continuing on that same theme, although I guess I would stretch it out to, I think a real challenge here is everybody seems to be looking for something that they can do. Whether we're talking about a treatment or even I would go as far as saying consumers. I really believe consumers are sitting there. I know conversations that I have at home with fellow friends that have children. They're saying, everybody tells me I shouldn't be eating something with antibiotics. So what can I do? And we talk about the antimicrobial resistance. So in this aspect of a common message, if it doesn't have an activity for someone to do, and I think that becomes the challenge, what's the activity for each one of those segments, for a DVM, for these producers, for every one of those segments, something that they can do? I think of an inner city that was dealing with a lot of gunshot deaths, and they talked about how the citizens started doing some CPR training, and one of the pieces that they included in that was crowd control. Instead of telling people to not take pictures, not take videos, they were starting to instruct people to go grab a glass of water, go get this, go do these things. And that's where the leadership spot really seems to be right now. We need to start telling people what is one thing they can do to help impact this. Even if it might be frivolous, even if we don't have the data to sit there and support it. So I guess I would sit there and say, for each of those segments, what is one thing that we can do? No takers? One thing. As a producer, I'm a producer. What can I go home and tell my parents tomorrow?
Well, I'll start. I think we've addressed that somewhat through the symposium with our friends from Elanco on their communication aspect. I mean, we don't tell our story well as an industry. If we look back and we're less than 2% of the population that we're trying to make our statement from that minute group that we have. So I mean, if I was going to start with one thing to take home is, and that's why we had the communication piece put in the symposium this year, is how you tell your story, and you have to start that groundswell of information getting out to combat, for lack of a better word, the information that's out there now. So if you had one simple thing to do, John, it'd be go home and tell your parents to tell their story. That work for you?
Well,
one thing just to add to that, I think part of that idea too is that if is to make sure that there is a common understanding or some consensus around what in fact are the talking points. I mean, what are the messages that, because while I agree we need to be maybe more proactive about getting out there and explaining things, but certainly it'd be desirable that those explanations be consistent and that you don't have many different messages that actually could just further confuse folks. So I think that sort of plays into the idea that what is your sort of bumper sticker kind of statement around what it is we're trying to do and accomplish with to address the concerns that are there with regard to antibiotics and more particularly use of antibiotics in animal agriculture. And clearly that it gets distilled down in a way that gets distorted, and if the discussions around raising animals without antibiotics starts to send people down the path of if this product is raised without antibiotics, then this other product must have antibiotics in it, and certainly that's confusing people. So I think part of this, I guess one point is to help with that point, which I think is a good point, is making sure that we have some clear a clear message and that there's consistency in terms of how that message is being that when that's being delivered, that there's a clear common set of talking points that we can be speaking from.
I was thinking about that topic last night, and I know there's people that are out there that are experts in messaging, and I'm not one of those. I don't know what percentage of people are really concerned about the use of antibiotics, the judicious use of antibiotics in food animals. We know that we hear the activists, but nonetheless, they get people's attention. But one of the things I was thinking about is I think we need to tell our story better. Farm families, ranch families, so maybe that becomes part of the beef is what's for dinner ad, that the woman who is, she and her husband ranch is there with the kids and they're caring for the livestock, and when they explain that this is what we do in very simple terms, I think that has a positive impact on people. I was at a meeting a year or two ago and we were supposed to speak on why we use antibiotics in food-producing animals, and some of the producers, I felt like they got maybe overly protective of the industry and said, we do it because we care for our animals. If they get sick, by George, we're going to treat them. And I don't know that they really got a positive message across with the tone of that, but for people to understand how animals are cared for from birth all the way through the process, I think will help them to understand that the vast majority of cattle don't receive an antibiotic by injection. And we're working on, or we've got the VFD now, which took out the medically important antibiotics from the production chain, and I think that was a positive step. So there's a few other things we've got to work on along that issue, but we're not hoping that these animals get sick because our hospital in a feedlot or in a swine operation is a profit center for that producer. We're in the hotel and restaurant business in the feed yard, and if we can keep the animals healthy, they're going to eat more, and that's what drives our income, is selling feed, not selling medicine, although there is a markup to cover the expense associated with a sick animal. But I think sometimes we get into this discussion deep enough that we say, well, gosh, you're just giving antibiotics to everything. It's a willy-nilly decision, and it's not. It's a small proportion. And then in relation to the withdrawal time, more of the antibiotics are administered by injection early in the feeding period, and as someone mentioned yesterday, the typical feedlot animal is on feed for 150 or 160 days. So these established withdrawal times are exceeded greatly. The longest withdrawal time that we have is 60 days, and that's for a vaccine, has an oil adjuvant in it. The others are from about 42 days and less, and so many of those animals are marketed after more than 100 days after they receive the antibiotic. So we've got a good story to tell. We need to figure out how to message that and get that out, not only on an individual basis, but to masses.
Yep. Following up on that, I'll give an example from last year. One of our producers was a young feedlot owner out of Idaho that came here just scared to death he was going to have to defend what he did. And when he got here and had the discussion with people from CDC, people from FDA, people from USDA, all they really wanted to know is understand. And if you remember what I challenged you to do at the beginning of the meeting is listen to understand. If we can get in that dialogue and have that discussion and help them understand, it's really that they're become more impressed with the technology that we use, with the passion they have for the business, as Dr. Smith mentioned, and where we're going for the care of the animals. I think if you ask Dr. Solomon, my co-chair, he had the privilege of visiting the High Plains Research Center with me and got to see firsthand, understand what actually happened out there in the technology that we use. And Dr. Smith, you alluded to a lot of the technology we use that people just don't have the exposure to that, with most generations being 3 to 5, whatever piece you read, removed from agriculture, removed from the farm. That's where the gap is in that messaging.
And just really quickly to follow up, I know over the last 2 days, Joe had mentioned the effort that Farm Foundation is engaged in with Pew, where we're trying to define what are those core components of stewardship, try to reach some agreement across different species. And the idea is to come up with very specific things that can be done on the farm, animal health plans, prevention programs, etc., that are core components of antibiotic stewardship, and that we'll all have some agreement that those are the right things to do, and that gives some very concrete examples of what to do with regard to antibiotic stewardship and how to tell that story.
Yeah, Tom Schrag. I'd like to just expand the conversation. We've been talking really pretty much exclusively about antibiotics, what goes on the farm, in the animal bug-drug combinations. But if you start to think a little bit more into the next phase, which would be human exposure, and you get retail meats involved, there's been some pretty amazing technologies and results where we still have, like pan-susceptible salmonella is becoming quite prevalent in the NARMS retail meats program. And the fact that we're talking just that subset that's AMR bacteria that are foodborne, we overlook the rest of those pathogens that are still there. So the question kind of becomes, are we so focused now just on that subset that has a resistance gene or more that we're starting to forget a little bit about some of the other bugs that might be on the retail meats, and how does that influence what might also be done on farm to try to mitigate the prevalence, say, Salmonella, Campylobacter, et cetera?
If I've ever seen a case of clinical campylobacteriosis in a beef animal, I missed it. So that's a concern on the zoonotic side or the human side. So here we focus primarily on these enteric pathogens that Tom just mentioned. But when I go back to work tomorrow, I will be more concerned about the respiratory pathogens and so forth. And so we have to balance that out. And we have the welfare issues and the production issues, as well as the animal health versus the human health side. And certainly we can't ignore any of those. They're all very, very important. But I think that the antibiotic usage is something that impacts our day-to-day health of livestock and not just the zoonotic side of that. So we have to keep that in mind. I think we're seeing a difference in our susceptibility profiles when we send pathogens from our respiratory cases, for example, off to a diagnostic lab. And that's very concerning on a day-to-day basis. But all the things we do to try to mitigate the foodborne pathogens still apply to those pathogens which affect the animals alone. There was a speaker last year, which I think she was one of our opening speakers, said that we are having development of resistance to antibiotics on the human side and the veterinary side in parallel. And from my viewpoint, I think that is happening. And there's a few of those that cross the lines to go from the animal side to the human side, or, as mentioned earlier, maybe from the human side over to the animal side.
So just adding a comment to that, I think from a focus and sort of resource standpoint, clearly, historically, much of the focus has been on the foodborne pathogens and the foodborne pathway, and that's where much of the resources have gotten focused. NARMS as an example. And I think that, as you point out, I think the challenge with that is that we aren't perhaps paying as much attention to other bacteria, other pathogens, animal pathogens. The challenge with that, too, is that, of course, those are the issues that are more sort of front and center for producers, on the farm in terms of how antibiotic resistance can more directly impact them in terms of the animal pathogens that they're trying to manage, which, again, focusing only on foodborne can be a bit of a disconnect for them because those pathogens may not really be an issue, in many cases aren't an issue for them. So I agree there that there's a bit of a disconnect there, and the challenge, I guess, is a resource one, too, where the limited amount of resources that's come up before about limited resources that's been put towards expanding data collection and enhancing surveillance and data collection has been a real limiter. And I think this not expanding to other pathogens, particularly target animal pathogens, is also a consequence of that resource issue.
Joe Swedberg. A lot of companies today's decisions are driven by shareholders and consumers, of course, particularly in the food and ag side. But I'm curious, and this is kind of targeted to Lori and I know Karin a little bit also, with regards to how do you communicate with those groups that have interests in this area? And again, there's some are pretty major investors. There's some groups out there, particularly around the faith-based area, and they are very interested in what you're doing is regard to animal welfare and antibiotic use, how you manage that. So I think it's an interesting one. I know you have some background on that, but I think it's interesting for the group to hear how do we communicate with those groups to understand and educate as best you can.
In our experience with shareholder resolutions, in the past, it's been, and producers and manufacturers alike have taken the activists or the NGOs, the people who want to change our behavior or find out about our behavior. We've sort of given them the stiff arm, and the shareholder resolution then had become a tool to start a conversation or to gain access into the companies. And we have found that, and going back to being able to tell our story, it doesn't do us a lot of good to tell our story to each other. We have to tell our story to the people who don't understand our stories. So we've evolved from not speaking to people who didn't necessarily agree with us to shareholder resolutions and then sort of being forced in to negotiate a withdrawal of a shareholder resolution based on some consensus or some deal that you strike to have the shareholder resolution removed. But we have found in past years that really the dialogues between those who don't necessarily agree can be much richer than the dialogues we just have with each other. I mean, we can preach to the choir, or we can actually go out into these organizations and have these conversations. And I think it develops, in my personal experience, it's really developed a lot of two-way understanding. And I think when all stakeholders are involved, we tell our story to the people who need to hear our stories, and they tell their stories to us. And I really think that really can improve the situation for everyone.
I'm not sure how much exactly I can add to this, but I had the opportunity recently to attend a meeting that brought together different faith-based investors as well as companies that are valuing other corporations for the market. And it was really fascinating to hear how a lot of these companies that are trying to assess risks 10, 15 years down the line, how they are looking at antibiotic use policies and how the companies are performing as one indicator of risk and one predictor of future success. So that was very fascinating for me.
And so just a month ago, they had the social impact investing group, social investing group meet in California for a meeting, Joe. And so this impact investing has both the social responsibility side, but there's another portion of that, a shareholder, that is the sustainability side too. And you have sustainability investors that look at companies. And so as we go forward with our messaging, I think we probably need to include that as part of our messaging to go out to those types of investment groups.
Richard Coulter. Excuse me. I was just going to pick up, maybe make a comment on a question a minute ago, which was, what can the average person do? What can the average farmer do in terms of playing into this game? If you're a whole genome sequencer, there's lots of stuff you can do in epidemiology. But how can the average farmer do stuff? I think in a conference like this, it's very easy for everyone to sort of become a hammer and look for a nail. We're talking about antibiotic use begetting antibiotic resistance, so we all look to pound on antibiotic use and say, well, that's the nail that we antibiotic use hammers can pound on. But if we take a step back and we say, what are the really big and impactful things that are going to have world influence that farmers can do? One of the issues I think that we've discussed a lot in this meeting is the interrelatedness, the One Health sort of concept. And while reducing antibiotic use on farm is a good sort of thing to do, where farming might be a really big player in terms of antimicrobial resistance is the catchment and amplification of significant resistance genes. So to put a sort of fine point on that, recently we've identified in US farms a couple of cases of MCR1 resistance gene to colistin. Okay, so no American farmer uses colistin in his hog operations or his cattle operations or his chicken operations. So, but what does that say? That says that those farms got those genes from epidemiological spread from the human population. So what can farmers do?
So your question was going to be, what can farmers do to mitigate that?
No.
Is already going with it?
Is this the microphone? Yeah. So the point was, biosecurity is very important. And biosecurity, like cooking, is something that everyone can do. Everyone who's got a farm, it doesn't matter whether it's a big integrated, part of a big integration farm, where there are many vets involved, maybe epidemiologists who can advise on biosecurity and monitoring of people entering the farm and leaving the farm, looking at vectors like water and, that kind of stuff, or whether it's an individual, cow-calf type operation. You can consider biosecurity. You can consider protecting your animals from essentially the evils of the human population. There are big cities out there where there are many resistance genes, and the big threat is those resistance genes selected for by the use of high-value antibiotics in human medicine, carbapenems, fluoroquinolones, etc., colistin maybe, can spread back to the farm, and large animal populations can amplify those genes and feed them back into the human population through the food chain. So basic things like good biosecurity are something that I think every farmer can do. And again, talking to all your friends about the importance of cooking your food. If food spread is an important vector back to the human population, making sure, as Dr. Carver said the other day, Home Ec 101, cook your food. Control spread that way. Every solution doesn't have to be about antibiotic use and how we sort of pound down on 100 kilograms is bad, 99 is better, 98 is even better again, 0 is perfect. That's not necessarily going to solve all the problems of antimicrobial resistance, particularly the really big ones that threaten the human population. So that's a comment, not a question, but every farmer can do it.
Good morning. Kay Johnson-Smith with the Animal Ag Alliance. This is really more of a comment, I guess, but related to the discussion. And first of all, I'm always impressed by how much work our industry does to try to solve problems in our industry. And so kudos to NIAA and this whole group for the meeting. Our mission is to help bridge the communications gap between farm and fork. And so we're really that communications component up for the industry. And I am really glad that communications is part of the discussion today. One resource I'd like to direct everybody to on this topic that we update every year is called our Advances in Agriculture, Advances in Animal Agriculture report. We just released the 2017 report a couple of weeks ago, and you can find it on our website. But it takes a look at the talking points and the key issues that hopefully will help everyone tell this story about our industry's continuous improvement in the areas of responsible use of antibiotics, animal welfare, sustainability, and food safety. And it's broken out by species, so it's a nice summary that each year we take a look at how we are continuously improving. We're going to have some printed copies, but for you all to have, put them in your doctor's offices, waiting rooms, your dentist's office waiting rooms. Share the link. We also have an infographic that helps tell that story so the millennials can, get all the information without reading a 20-page report. But it's just our way to help communicate all of the great things that you all are doing. So anyway, I just wanted to direct everybody to that resource. animalagalliance.org. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to follow up on Kate's comments. How do we take the message and turn it positive? And I think that's kind of what she was getting at. So much of the messaging that's been out there, and we talk about communicating, is all negative about what the industry has done or what the industry has to do, the negative impact animal agriculture has had on antibiotic resistance. But if I think about or sit back and realize the changes the industry has gone through in the last decade to make real changes on the farm, and Dr. Granger and I were talking about this yesterday. He kind of joked with me. He said, Ernie, every time you talk about the financial impact it has on the farmer. Okay? And of all of our industries sitting in here, the farmer is the only one, maybe not the only one, but they have taken the biggest brunt of a financial impact on this change of any of us. Most of the rest of the industries are benefiting from this, whether it's the advocacy that they do or the job that they do from an agency or governmental standpoint, or potentially adding value to a veterinary responsibility on a farm. But the farmer's the one that has bore the financial impact and has been caused to make the most change. So how do we turn that messaging and make it positive about the advancements that we've made and put it in a simple message that the consumers can understand? There was a young lady sitting over here yesterday who was pretty proud of the fact that she forced change or helped to bring about change in the marketplace by a lot of the retailers with the movement towards antibiotic-free and forcing marketing changes and marketing requirements on the industry. That's her passion, and that's okay, but what does that mean, and how do we turn it around and make it a positive change or positive messaging for animal agriculture? The other part of this panel discussion is what research do we need to continue to have? And we've all heard about the One Health approach a lot the last few days, but specifically the last few years. And I continue to see research and advancements in animal agriculture, but I'm not sure we continue to move the human medicine side of this forward fast enough to make significant change there. So how do we continue to communicate with them in the right manner? I know that's a big question and there's an awful lot there, but it's an important part of the discussion.
I do have a couple comments from a producer perspective of what I'm going to take home and the key messages that I've heard from this symposium. And so much of it is around that communication piece, whether it's communicating with public, the consuming public, or honestly communicating between ourselves. And even at home, communicating with my veterinarian and my nutritionist and all the other people that play a role in our operation every day. I don't think we do a very good job of it, unfortunately, having that two-way communication even between ourselves and having that unified message in front going forward amongst all of us within animal ag. And honestly, even having that conversation with our doctor when we take our kids in for a checkup, having these types of communications and an open line of communication, which sometimes can be a struggle within our industry and with other people, of having that open, honest, positive communication and message. And also one thing I do think is very important from a producer side, and a couple of them mentioned, is the economics. We all do have to understand how economics drives every decision in what we do. We all, in one way or another, are being paid to be here today. So there is an economic piece to everything that we do within our everyday decisions and lives and careers. So just thoughts for the group, not necessarily, any questions or comments, but that's what I'm going to take away as a producer.
There are a lot of resources that are available. They're good resources, but they're perhaps not reaching all of the masses. For example, the beef industry has a checkoff. Every animal is sold, you contribute $1. There's a vote today in Oklahoma to add another $1 to that to increase the funds available for the farmers and ranchers in Oklahoma to promote beef, put that back on the table. The only thing it can be used for is things that would promote beef consumption. The pork board has a checkoff. They do the same thing, and I don't know what I don't know what the poultry industry does, but I know you've got your egg board and on and on. But through the beef side, for example, they interact with physicians, and they bring the newest research information to them. They interact with chefs. They have a kitchen there in their headquarters in Denver where they bring chefs in and say, this is how you can prepare beef, different recipes, and these are some of the health issues that people ask about, and these are some of the questions that we can answer based upon research. There's also programs where they take this information to school teachers, especially at the elementary level, to encourage those teachers to look at the data and then provide that information as part of the class material when that's appropriate. So those things are there. I think we've done a good job probably preparing those things, and we've touched a lot of people, but the question is, how can we then expand that to a broader audience out there? We've got people that will from time to time be called upon to speak on a radio, television interview, and so forth, but how many people see that? We mentioned yesterday, of course, social media is one way to expand that discussion. I'm not a social media freak myself. I figure 125, 150 emails a day is all I can handle, but I'm ready to turn that baton over to the younger generation to handle that side of it. So there are some things that are there. It's not like the industries have been sitting on their past history of success and saying this is going to carry us on into the future. They are investing in this on a regular basis.
Maybe one comment to add is, on the messaging issue is the fact that I think that in the absence of there being, sort of proactive efforts to articulate what folks are doing, it creates a bit of a black box effect, and those messages will get filled in by others. So I think there's it's in the interest of the industry to be making a case for what they're doing to, raise animals responsibly. And part of that effort it includes managing animal disease, and one of the tools for that is antibiotics. And this is what we're doing to help manage animal health and animal welfare through good practices, which in some cases necessitates the need to use antibiotics. An example being, one of the issues that continues to be a thorny issue that I think we still have more work to do relates to use of these drugs for prevention purposes. That's an area that there's still a lot of concern and disagreement over that, and I think there's an area where I think from FDA's standpoint we've taken the position that we do see prevention use of antimicrobials, including medically important antimicrobials, to have a role to play, or an important role to play, in managing disease in animal agricultural settings. Are all the uses that are out there now and all the practices used for that, optimized? No, I don't think they are. So I think, but in the absence of getting out and saying, look, this is how we're using them, this is what we're doing to make sure that we're using them only when we need to in a way to manage disease effectively, the perception is that's just filled in, and I'll echo what Dr. Smith said. There's sort of this notion of that just, they're being used willy-nilly and just as a matter of standard operating procedure to include antibiotics to prevent whatever disease should happen to come along. Certainly that is not, what is likely happening in many cases, but I think that's something that being a bit more proactive about, to say this is how antibiotics are being used and the role that they're playing in terms of managing disease in animals.
I want to take a minute to respond to Ernie. You're right. 48 hours pretty much based on animal ag and what can animal ag do to help reduce antibiotic resistance. So speaking as a physician, as we wind up the conference, we've already heard in the last 2 days that Joint Commission for Accreditation of Hospitals requires antibiotic stewardship programs in every accredited hospital, of which probably 95% of our hospitals are accredited. Centers for Medicaid, Medicare services require all nursing homes to have antibiotic stewardship programs, and probably will require hospitals somewhere in the near future. And I'm like Bob, I'm not good enough to use my smartphone and find out this number real quick while I was waiting, but I've done it on my PC. If you go look up the Centers for Disease Control for methicillin-resistant Staph aureus numbers, you'll see that with the efforts of the hospitals and the CDC and others, the incidence of methicillin-resistant Staph aureus coming from healthcare facilities and also from the community has dropped by about 50% in the last 10 years. So I just want to let you know that on the human side, we are making progress over there in strides, probably not fast enough. And yes, I overprescribed when I was in a busy clinic and had kids crying and screaming with high fevers and a waiting room full of them before I could get home. I won't deny it. But other things like the rapid screen test, we no longer prescribe antibiotics for viral pharyngitis because we can tell in 5 minutes whether that kid's got strep throat or not. When I started practice, we didn't have that. We need more tools like that also for community-acquired infections like sinusitis or bronchitis. Is it a virus? Statistics say it's probably a virus, so don't give them a Z-Pack. If I don't give them a Z-Pack and they come back 2 days later with streptococcal pneumonia and die, guess who gets sued? So, yeah, there's overprescribing. I just want you to know human healthcare side is also working on this problem.
Thanks. So I'll follow up perfectly from that. So I talked earlier yesterday about collaboration. I think communication is very important for that. So what we want to do from the CDC side, and we've had this discussion, is be a lot better about gathering our information from the human side, CDC, and getting it through NIAA out to all of you so that we can keep you posted. Because there is a lot going on both sides. I've learned so much being here, and I want to continue with that learning so that I'm aware of everything that's going on. Because a lot of times we can find places to work together better with that, but keeping at least what we can do is keep all of you informed of what is happening and how we're moving forward. So as you see things come through NIAA from us, please take a look at it and then feel free to reach back and ask us questions. We can get more information, we can talk with you, have conversations. That's what we want. So as far as us being here now, I have business cards, Sarah, working on communication for antimicrobial resistance, and we also have policy here, Jeff and Amanda. So we have business cards we want to leave with you or go through Katie and others at NIAA, and we will continue to share with you to keep the doors of communication open so that you can be aware of what's happening. We'll watch and we'll provide from our side. So thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. This has been outstanding conversation, and this is exactly where we wanted to go and what we needed to get done. We're right on time in terms of our break. We will be coming back here in 30 minutes. It's 10:45. We'll be back here at 11:15. Meanwhile, please give your panel a round of applause.